one can argue that best, better, and worst are subjective. But what if you're talking about something objective, like how much of the coffee you're brewing is being extracted? In other words, as far as extraction is concerned, how much of the coffee in my cup is coffee and how much of it is water? If what Matt said in our last episode is true, that is, more extraction is always better unless you screw it up, then in this case, you can argue something might actually be better. Today, we consider if brewing Turkish coffee might not be the worst way to brew coffee, as some claim. What if it is, in fact, the best way? So get your saucepans ready, because for today's episode, Matt Perger joins us again, this time to cover Turkish coffee, and more about his work at Barista Hustle. Oh, and don't worry about that saucepan comment, it'll make sense later.
Ibrik, or Cezve, as it's also called, is, I think, maybe, if not one of the oldest coffee brewing methods.
Now, this sounds like coffee history. Let's get Professor Jonathan Morse back on the line. Professor, is the Ibrik the oldest coffee brewing method?
Hi, Jesse. I'm going to say that the Cezve almost certainly is the oldest of apparatus developed specifically for the task of coffee brewing, and I'm pretty certain that it's the oldest form of apparatus that we use today. But I think what I want to start off by saying to you is the importance of differentiating that Cezve from the Ibrik. They're two different things. The Cezve is the brewing vessel. It's what we make the coffee with. The Ibrik originally is the serving vessel. It's what we pour the final coffee from. And we transfer, therefore, coffee when it's brewed from the Cezve to the Ibrik to then serve. Now, the Cezve is, as you know, it's a brewing vessel. It has that long handle. That's the first thing that we see developed so that it can be placed over the fire and removed from it without injuring the user, the brewer. It's got that open top so we don't get the development of pressure. We don't blow it up. So think about if we'd used an Ibrik with a sealable lid, we have a whole different problem. It's got that sort of sloping in and out shape, the kind of conical shape, so that when you do the transfers, whether you're transferring from Ibrik to Ibrik, because sometimes people will do more than one pour to pour, transfer from Cezve to Cezve, and then from Cezve to Ibrik, so it holds back the grounds. There's a slight difference between the Ibrik and the Dala, and the Dala is really the Arabian vessel. It's the original vessel which is used for serving. They're bigger with those really big bulbous shapes, and the idea is that you get a lot of weight into the bottom of those pots and you could stand them in the sand. So you brew with your Cezve, and then eventually once it's brewed you place it into your Dala, you serve from your Dala, and you probably retain a bit more coffee in your Dala, and you're able to stand that Dala in the sand, which would be somewhat more difficult to do with the smaller Cezve. The Ibrik, in fact, you can see, I would say, actually, by the by, you can see in books, including my book, of course, some pictures of people actually standing those Dalas in the sand. Now, the Ibrik is slightly different. It really develops more with that thing that we come to think of as that very sort of tall, narrow-necked serving vessel, more sort of North African, Turkish. Why? Well, reduces spillage so you don't have a sudden sort of flow of coffee through it. Very, very decorative. You can put lots of decoration on. You can create beautiful looking forms. It's a very tactile, very beautiful thing to look at. It's not really a practical brewer. And indeed, nowadays, if there are plugins and electrical brewers and all those kinds of things that are actually still being done with Cezves and indeed with Dalas, so that you brew into the pot, because you then obviously now can control that much more. But there's a fascinating thing about why am I trying to distinguish between the Cezve and the Ibrik for you, because the Ibrik is much easier to pronounce, as you've probably noticed from the way that I'm talking. And so the Ibrik becomes a word that within the coffee world, the dominantly European coffee world, we start to interchange the terms Cezve and Ibrik. We use the Ibrik to refer to the Cezve because A, it's all somehow Turkish and Ottoman, and B, it's just a lot easier to pronounce. And indeed, if we look at sort of some more kind of Europeanized version of that, we get the whole notion of the brickie. Again, the same pot, but with a more easily pronounced name. And that's why we actually have those World Brewing Cezve Ibrik champions. One thing to say finally is there's no doubt, going back to the Cezve or the Cezve, that it is the vessel that was first used also in Europe. If you look at pictures again of the early European coffee houses, you'll see vessels that are very clearly like Cezves stacked up within them, just as you will within representations of Turkish coffee houses. So the Cezve, yes, for me, the oldest dedicated coffee brewing pot, and certainly the oldest form of coffee making still in existence.
Sounds like myths within a myth. Mythception, right? Well, thanks for that, Professor Morris. That's a lot to chew on. Let's get back to Matt.
And it's used to make what's called Turkish coffee. It's got history all around the sort of the Levant, Middle East, Mediterranean area. Like every country around there has a different name for it. Cezve, Kanaka, Galaye, Ibrik, Cezve, Cezve. You know, like everyone has their own version of this brewing method in that area of the world. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of spread around because it works. And essentially it's this little long-handled pot. It's about maybe 150 mils, so like not even a cup. And the way you would normally brew it is by pouring in some coffee, super, super fine grind, like finer than a burr grinder can make is optimum. Then you put in a little bit of cold water, give it a stir, make sure it's all saturated. And then you add the rest of your brewing water cold up to your desired amount. And then you either would put this little pot on a stove, a sand pit, not the kind that you play in, you would die, but it's like a little box or tray that holds a couple of liters of sand that's being heated. You know, you can imagine in the desert fire pit, you know, you've got the sand and, you know, a lot of different cultures cook things in the sand or the soil near a fire. With this, you can imagine that long handle you're trying to keep away from the fire, and you stick that little pot into the sand next to the fire and wait for it to boil. And then you take it off the heat and decant it into your cup. So, you know, with the little sand pit on the bench, it's a little bit less risky. You just bury this pot in the hot sand until it boils or until it reaches the temperature you want, and then decant the coffee out. Now, you're probably imagining, oh, gee whiz, that's going to be a lot of sediment and that's going to be really rough. And, you know, it is a primitive form of brewing coffee. There is a technique that was brought to my attention by Jeremy Challender called the Wendelhoff. I'm sure there are other people around the world who have done this before, but it's customary for the modern specialty coffee professional to then pour it through a paper filter to get rid of all that sediment. So the brewing process maybe takes a minute and it's barely in contact with the hot water for very long, and then it's out. You've decanted it.
Right, in and out.
And in and out, really quick. What did we do the other day? We just posted a video. If you YouTube Barista Hustle and Ibrik or Cezve, we posted a brew guide on how to do this. And we did it with a Kenyan coffee from Five Elephant. And it's just sensational, Jesse. Just beautiful, so evenly extracted and sweet.
So there's a reason this is on our myth episode, and it's because a lot of people think this is a horrible way to brew coffee, and I've been told it's the worst way to brew coffee. Why would people even argue that? What do you think is contributing to that thought?
Well, blame the player, not the game here, where a lot of people would brew Cezve coffee with the lightest roast you have ever seen. Jam your grinder by like opening the bag, kind of light.
Okay.
Like orange color coffee. And some people also, for their Cezve, use extremely dark roasts. And if you're perfectly evenly extracting a terrible roast, you are going to taste a terrible roast perfectly evenly. So I would say that the problem with this brewing method is usually the traditions surrounding the style of roast and quality of beans that are generally used in it. So you can have a terrible AeroPress, you can have an excellent AeroPress. Same with Cezve. You can have a terrible one or you can have an exquisite one. So if you put a well-roasted coffee in there and treat it well, you know, extract it properly, it's going to taste just absolutely marvelous because the grind is so fine that you're getting everything. You're getting everything at once.
So this is definitely supporting your last statement about more extraction is better. And you've even said to me in an email, you think it's the perfect brewing method. Do you stand by that?
Technically, for extraction, yes, because it's the only brew method where you're definitely getting everything and you still have control over the time, the grind size, the water temperature. You even get to mix the coffee into the water when it's cold. So you know that your extraction is going to be perfectly even. Like there's never any coffee getting hot water before other grinds.
I see.
Like everything about it is just technically perfect for getting the most out of a cup of coffee.
So here's a challenge to our listeners then. I guess it's time to go purchase your new brew method. I don't think it's very common to have one of these in your home. Depending on if you're in the US, I don't think it's very common, but outside the US, I'm sure it's very common.
I mean, do you have a saucepan? Yes, probably. Go for it. all this thing is a saucepan.
That's right.
And if you've got a V60 and some papers, you're ready to clarify that bad boy straight afterwards.
All right, so saucepan it is. You don't even need to go purchase anything.
Yeah, I mean, give it a good scrub so you don't get too much bolognese.
Yeah, this
flavor,
one tastes like chicken.
Yeah, in your cup of coffee.
Yeah,
but there's nothing special about the brewer itself. It's mainly the fundamentals of the method, and that's why it works so well.
So, Matt, I'm thankful that you came on to the show to talk about these two particular myths. And we did discuss a little bit about why you think these myths exist. And we do think to an extent they can be a good thing for inspiration. There's other misinformation in our industry that might be harmful. More of the myths that are actually causing these inefficiencies and they're being sustained and what have you. Why do you think those kinds of beliefs and that kind of misinformation is sustained in our industry?
It's difficult because there isn't much money being able to be thrown around for research into these things. Unless you're Nestle and they don't need to tell anyone what they learned, really.
Right, proprietary research.
Britta Fulmer, I think she was their nutritionist, incredibly intelligent woman who wrote a book on coffee science recently, and that was based upon a lot of the Nestle research. But I bet all the juicy stuff is still behind closed doors, and the rest of the coffee industry, like the specialty industry in particular, we just don't have the capacity to perform this kind of research that's required to bust myths. And it would be lovely if we did, but research is expensive.
Yeah. It's a wonder that there's not some form of public funded research in coffee at this point. Like, I mean, I can think of some companies that come to mind that are not necessarily public, but like World Coffee Research is funded through their programs and what have you. But there's nothing really busting myths in that format. It's kind of an interesting thing. And
I know that SCA, spearheaded by Peter Giuliano, is doing some great things with universities in the US, and they're getting some great sponsorship money from some really forward-thinking companies to promote and conduct research. So it's definitely moving that way, but there's a lot of myths to cover,
Yeah.
I try to do some of that with our work at Barista Hustle. We've started charging for education so that we can perform some more primary research. But wowee, is it expensive to do?
Yeah. Well, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about what your projects are currently at Barista Hustle?
I had a blog for a while and it was all free, and I was just sort of like picking things out of my head that I knew or, that I'd learnt, and I was sharing all of those things. And eventually I hit a wall and I couldn't just come up with articles on the cheap anymore. I needed to start doing research, and research is expensive. It takes a lot of time to create content when you can't just sit down and write. So as Barista Hustle, we started selling educational content instead of just giving it away. And the quality of the content is tenfold what it was when I was just regurgitating what I knew. We back it up with research papers. We go and talk to experts in certain fields, and we really spend our time going through that process. It's just so much better than the blog. And what we've started to do is we were selling some courses. So we made 2 different courses and we were selling them individually. And what we've done recently, because a lot of cafe owners and managers and small businesses were sort of a little bit hesitant to pay upfront for coffee courses, what we've now done is launched a subscription that's much more affordable upfront, and businesses can pay per barista that access that subscription, and they get all of it.
Cool.
So as soon as you're on the you get everything. And at the moment, it's like $15 US a month per barista, which I think is pretty darn cheap. And that's an early adopter pricing that won't be around forever. But we knew that there were a lot of people who wanted to do it, and we wanted to see if it would work. So we just started it. And the response has been unbelievable.
Well, awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, and we're now translating into, I think, 8 languages. I'm off to Moscow next week to launch Russian. I'm going to Tokyo and Osaka in November to launch Japanese. And we have local partners in each country.
That's great.
To do the translations, make sure it's still relevant to local equipment and stuff, and do the marketing for us. So we're partnering with people in each language. Honestly, Jesse, I'm a little bit more excited about the other languages than I am about English because they have so little resources. Mm-hmm. Compared to us English speakers, we are just plush with coffee education.
Yeah.
By comparison.
Yeah.
So I'm really excited about all of this, and I think it'll help. Maybe we can do a myth busting series in there as well. Go a little bit deeper.
Yeah.
Like yourself, try to dispel, and help baristas earn more, help cafes be more efficient, help everyone make more money and do good. Is kind of the aim.
Well, it sounds great, Matt. Where can our listeners find your website and maybe a direct portal to this learning program that you have launched?
So baristahustle.com is our main page, and we're in the process of going to a new website, but that should be done relatively quickly. And on Instagram, we're just at Barista Hustle. It's pretty easy to find everything on the website, and we're constantly yelling about stuff on the social medias. So if you, and Instagram's our most active social media platform. So either navigate there and maybe join our email or something, or just follow us on Instagram, and you'll get a good idea for what's going on. We're also throwing out a lot of free information on the Instagram soon, sort of taking tidbits from the courses and making like bite-sized versions of them.
Great.
For Instagram. So if you follow us, you'll actually learn some stuff that cost other people some money. So I would highly recommend it.
Right on. Well, Matt, thanks for joining us for these 2 myths busted, and thanks for sharing the information about Barista Hustle.
No worries, Jesse. Really, really enjoyed myself. Thank you.
So did you think Turkish coffee was a bad way to brew coffee? Did this conversation challenge the way you think? It certainly challenged the way I think, and I'm looking forward to trying the Barista Hustle Turkish coffee recipe, link in description, out in my saucepan, after a thorough cleaning, of course. Let us know your thoughts about this episode on our Instagram under the post with the text that says, Turkish coffee best brew, so we can keep this conversation moving on social media. And now the moment some of you have been waiting for. Notice how I didn't say all, because that's funny, right? So as some of you know, my wife and I took a trip to New Zealand not too long ago, and we hit everybody up on Instagram and said, hey, we're going to New Zealand. What coffee spot should we visit? And y'all were so helpful in helping us find coffee shops we should visit. And I would love to say that our coffee adventures went really swell, but the reality of it is our coffee adventures really fell pretty flat, and it's not because of the coffee. When we first arrived in New Zealand, our first day was going to be in Auckland, and there's a lot of jokes about Aucklanders, and I don't really understand it. But anyway, that's beside the point. We're in Auckland. Well, we're not in Auckland. We're in the airport, and we realized that there is bio-checks, I guess biosecurity, and we weren't really anticipating this, and we were at the airport for a very long time. Well, lo and behold, we go and we pick up our camper van, which is how we were trailing from the North Island to the South Island. And turns out that we got our van just in time for all the coffee shops to be closed in Auckland. So major disappointment there. So real quick, let me just thank the people who recommended, and if I miss you, I am really sorry. But so let's see here. We had Kakako Cafe. So that was Brentley Hemphill and the cafe itself, and the handpicked coffee. Really wanted to try that. AP Payne and Magnificent, Juru, and then let's see, ARK Coffee Company, that was magnificent as well. Espresso Coffee School, Barista Beaver, Little and Friday Choice Brews, The Tannery Choice Brews, and Honey Bones, Finstagram. Y'all, thank you for recommending those, and honestly, it's so sad we couldn't make any of those happen. So we began our journey down the North Island. I think it's fair to say there is coffee all over New Zealand. One of the things that really surprised me was the fact that every McDonald's, and yeah, I'm talking about the burger joint. Like if you live in the US, this is not a thing. All the McDonald's have espresso machines, and they have, I probably sound ridiculous for saying this, and they have baristas, and these baristas, some of them even have certifications, and in one of the shops I went to in Rotorua, they actually have the certification on display. Like that kind of coffee culture is, it's not seen at our McDonald's. Like, I don't even know what much to say. I mean, if you're in the US, have you seen one of these? I haven't. The other thing I noticed on our journeys from Auckland down to Wellington were that even the gas stations, I guess BP is the one I'm thinking of, all had espresso machines in them, and even other gas stations. And we stopped through other towns that were kind of smaller, and you'd go to a gas station and they have an espresso machine, and it's advertised made by baristas and things like that. And don't get me wrong, it's not necessarily specialty, right? But it's a espresso machine barista made. So that was pretty rad. Okay, so we traveled from Auckland to Coromandel, and the funny thing is, my wife's like, okay, we're gonna head to Cathedral Cove, right? And I like a numbskull, type in Coromandel on my GPS, and we just start going. So if you live in New Zealand or are familiar with the area, this is a massive area, and so we just basically went an hour and a half out of our way, not even close to where we were planning on going. And anyway, got kind of lost. It was absolutely beautiful. There was no coffee on this part of the trip, but yeah, we got totally lost. And then finally made it to Cathedral Cove and then Hot Water Beach. I mean, yeah, like a bunch of tourists, which is totally fine with me. And we reached Hot Waves Cafe, which is where we stopped and ate. And this is where I began to realize something about New Zealand coffee. I go in, we order our food, and I'm like, I want an iced coffee. This is not the first time I wanted an iced coffee. It's just like, I don't know, the fifth, because it's hot or something and I'm craving it. And, I go up and I say, hey, do you have an iced coffee? And she kindly says, yeah, we have an iced coffee. It comes with cream and sugar and ice cream, actually, in this one. I'm like, okay, that's not totally what I meant. But anyway, the point is, it was super tasty. But I started to realize at this point that iced coffee is not a thing in New Zealand. And now that I think about it, we had gone to a McDonald's back in Auckland because all the coffee shops are closed, and I did go in and I did ask for an iced coffee, and I got this strange look like, we don't do that. And I'm thinking, well, wait, it's McDonald's. Doesn't McDonald's do everything the same everywhere? And apparently not. And I'm not talking about cold brew. I'm talking about iced coffee, right? Iced coffee. And in the US, you go to McDonald's to get an iced coffee as sort of a guilty pleasure, right? Like, all the specialty coffee shops are closed. You have a really late night for, say, making podcasts or whatever, and you just want to crush this sweet, disgustingly sweet cream iced coffee, right? That's a thing. Jim Gaffigan knows what I'm talking about.
It's fun telling people you go to McDonald's. They always give you that look like, oh, I didn't know I was better than you.
But not New Zealand. As I'm saying these things, I'm feeling so judged. Don't judge me. Panama geishas all the way, right? Oh, did I say geisha? Not geisha? Womp womp. Okay, so then we headed on down to Rotorua after we did Hobbiton, of course. And then the next day, sorry, I'm skipping the days I didn't do coffee. The next day, we did Lake Taupo, which, oh my gosh, so beautiful. Love it. And we're going to stop at Arosta Coffee, recommended by Choice Brews. And again, just the trip didn't allow it, and it was closed. I think they closed at 3 o'clock, and we were going to be there at 3:30, and it was a sad day. And this was kind of the trend for us. So wait till we get to Wellington. That's where the story happens. So from Wednesday to Thursday, we actually drive, and we stay in Tongariro National Park. So beautiful. Wonderful stuff. Oh yeah, that's what I'm saying. From there, we were going to try to go to Arosta. Anyway, it didn't work out. We ended up driving to Martinborough for some wine tasting and stuff. And I mean, just one wine, because the wine tastings are ridiculously expensive, which is fine. And yeah, so then Thursday comes around, and you can tell at this point, I haven't had any specialty coffee, right? This hasn't... At this point, I'm in a specialty coffee drought. I feel like I'm in a specialty coffee desert. And we finally make it to Wellington. And everybody said, or a few people said, hey, go to Flight Coffee. So Scott Rayo told me, go to Flight Coffee. Barista Beaver said, hey, go to Flight Coffee. And then there was also Coffee Supreme. Coffee Supreme was recommended by Scott Rail and Coffee Changers. And then Havana Coffee Works. Tyler Ritchie, thanks for recommending that. Didn't get to go. And Pour and Twist, sorry, didn't get to go there. But I did make it to Flight Hanger and Coffee Supreme. So at first I thought it was called Flight. It was very confusing. And then I was like, oh wait, but the food at Hanger looks good. So my wife and I were like, well, let's go to Hanger for food and go to Flight for coffee. Well, it turns out, to my knowledge, Hanger is owned by Flight. So that was wonderful. And it is here that I can fairly say I had my first real flat white. But first I got the brew taster, like the three brews, which were awesome. I'm trying to remember what they were off the top of my head, but I'll post the Instagram photo. If I took one, man, I was so bad at taking photos on this trip. Anyway, the point is, it was like 0 to 100 coffee, specialty coffee desert, and then boom, wonderful flavors, wonderful coffee, Flight Coffee or Hanger Flight Coffee, Hanger Coffee in Wellington. Totally worth the go. And delicious coffee with baristas who are really killing it in there. And the food was phenomenal. So, wow. Yeah, so good. Such a good experience. I could eat probably 1 million of the breakfast sandwiches I only had one, the breakfast sandwich that I had. So the way the rest of the day goes is quite hectic. We went straight from Hanger to the What a Workshop, where they did all the Lord of the Rings stuff. Really awesome. Totally worth it to me. I love the Lord of the Rings stuff. Super into it. Great stuff. No coffee there. But there was a coffee shop down the street. So as we're leaving, my wife is like, you said you have to go to Coffee Supreme. We got to really squeeze this in. And so we're leaving, right? We're driving on the opposite side of the road, trying to be careful, obviously. And we pass a Coffee Supreme sign, and we're like, oh my gosh, we just left this parking spot. And there's like nowhere to park. And she's like, oh, we got to go back around. And we're like, oh, it's kind of a stressful situation. We find the park. And at this point, we're like really pressed for time because we have to catch a ferry later that day. And we still wanted to go to the Museum of New Zealand, which is also phenomenal. Anyway, so we stop and, we run up to the shop. And it turns out it's just a shop that is advertising that it serves Coffee Supreme. And I was so, at this point, so frustrated, right? Because I've only really experienced one of the many coffee shops on the list. So anyway, we get in, we're like, okay, we got to go to the museum. So we drive down to the Museum of New Zealand. We literally hit everything in that museum, I think almost in less than an hour, probably somewhere close to an hour. And then we had to look at things for souvenirs in the shop, which was also really awesome. At this point, we're talking we got 40 minutes to get in line for the ferry. And my wife's like, you've got to hit Coffee Supreme. We can't leave Wellington without you doing this, because this was the one that really caught my eye based on what people were saying was Coffee Supreme. So we kind of made this deal where we said, hey, if there's one on the way, there's literally one between the museum and the ferry. So if we turn onto the street and we see a parking spot, we're going to go for it. And I'm like, okay. And I'm like, odds are we're not going to find a parking spot, because I know the city downtown, parking was not easy necessarily, and you had to pay to park too in most places. And so we go and we drive, and sure enough, there's a parking spot just a block, I think, south of the Coffee Supreme. At this point, I think it's 3:30 or something, and they close at 4:00, by the way. So I hop out of the car and I run. I'm literally running. I run up the block. I run inside the Coffee Supreme like the rudest person in the world. The barista, they're getting ready. It's 30 minutes until close, and they're probably really ready for the day to be over. And I'm just like, what's your fastest coffee? Right? This is horrible. I don't ever want to look like this as a customer. And she's really kind to me, and she's all like, well, we shut down the espresso machine. I'm like, no. And she's like, well, we got cold brew. I'm not too crazy about cold brew. I like it, but it's not what I go for. So I'm like, okay, just give me a cold brew. I'm going to get out of here. I got to go right now. We're good. We have to be in line at the ferry in 10 minutes. And we're talking this is the deadline to be in line. We're really pushing it. So I get the cold brew. We jump into the car. We drive down to the ferry. And at some point between, leaving that parking spot and getting to the ferry, I took a sip of that cold brew. I put it down and I said, dang, That is some good stuff. It was some really good cold brew. I would go as far as to say it might be the best cold brew I've ever had. So, wow, I'm talking fast. I can tell because I'm running out of breath. Hopefully this isn't exhausting to listen to because I'm trying to crush this. It's late Thursday night and I'm posting tomorrow. The rest of the trip was kind of a blur because we decided to go to the South Island in the last minute. And really, the only other place we knew of for coffee, I think when we had planned and taken all the notes, that coffee was going to be in Christchurch. So we were really looking forward to Christchurch. But once we got to Christchurch, we had parked our car. Another situation where there's another Coffee Supreme, right? And I walked up to go to the Coffee Supreme and it's closed. It's just like, hey, we'll be back soon. Closed. Oh, brutal, right? And that was just before we had changed directions from going to C4 Coffee, which was recommended by AshCJ91 on Instagram. An Unknown Chapter Coffee, I don't think we ever got close to. Dan Be Creative, thank you for recommending that. Honestly, if this trip was about coffee, like if I was going for the purpose of coffee, like it would have been a major fail. But it wasn't a major fail because my wife and I have been dreaming to go to New Zealand, and it was really the trip of our dreams, and we got to do it in 7 days, which isn't long enough. But it's a beautiful country. The North Island, the South Island, they're both beautiful in different ways, and I don't think we got to fight about it, and I recommend everybody visit. That's kind of my thing. I don't know if Kiwis want me to say that, but it was beautiful, and the people are kind and nice. The food is really great. The scenes are just beautiful. I mean, Lord of the Rings was filmed there, and you get to see all these beautiful places, the Maori people, the culture. Yeah, phenomenal. It's just, I know that's a word I've been using, but I don't have another word for it. It was a really great trip. And my wife and I appreciate your coffee recommendations. And I'm going to bring this to a close because the train that runs by my house is about to go by, and that's another 5 minutes of me waiting for the house to stop shaking. So thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening to me ramble. Thanks for the recommendations for New Zealand. And as always, and until next time, happy brewing.